All right, guys, let's get started on today's webinar. Silver and gold. Welcome, webinar attendees who want to mine the trenches of UE4 knowledge. If you're digging for industry techniques to increase your shading and material creation knowledge, then this webinar is for you. My name is Frank Cordero, and I'm the host of today's webinar. For those who don't know me, I'm a former cleanup animator from Disney, former concept and art director at EA, freelance 2D and 3D artist and modeling instructor, and currently doing content marketing for CG Master Academy. By the way, we're excited to have our CGMA audience meet material prop artist Hugh Trombley. He'll be sharing some amazing professional insights and experiences in the game industry using UE4. And speaking of CGMA, today's webinar is sponsored by CG Master Academy. CG Master Academy is the leader in online digital art education in art, VFX, games, and now animation. CGMA strives to offer artists the highest quality education through the most affordable, accessible, and relevant courses in the entertainment, design, and production world. As a team founded by artists for artists, they are committed to enabling you to become a better artist by learning from the industry's best. Oh, smokes. And speaking of industry's best, all right, let me go ahead and just switch the screen so we could get a nice little picture of Hugh here, who's a handsome man here. And by the way, we're going to be talking a little bit about precious metals, shading, and material creation in UE4. There we go. And here's a really good picture of Hugh. When did you take this picture, man?
I think that's that's a photo I think my fiance took of me when we were on the BARTs, which is, for those of you who don't know what BART is, BART's the Bay Area Rapid Transit. It's our municipal light rail in the Bay Area. I hail from Fremont in the Bay Area. And she's a photographer, so of course she takes the best looking photos of me, and I try my best, but I'm not a good photographer.
That's very kind, and I'm sure she appreciates that sort of compliment of just being like the one that takes all the best pictures of you. So that's great. So so speaking of the industry's best, let's do a little bragging about Hugh. Hugh Trombley is currently working as a material prop artist at Sanzaru Games. He's been on numerous environments on various AAA productions and projects for over 5 years. He's worked on projects like Infinity Ward, Call of Duty, Infinite Warfare. He's been at Sanzaru Games, Marvel, Powers United, and Asgard's Wrath. Let's give a hearty, warm CGMA welcome to Hugh Trombley. Yay! Woo-hoo! And by the way, to our attendees today in today's webinar, please put your questions in a dedicated Q&A part of the chat. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as time allows, where they're relevant in the conversation. I know Hugh's got a little bit of a presentation to be doing. So speaking of Hugh, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing pretty good. I was able to take off a little bit of time for work, and this is my first ever webinar. So I'm very excited to kind of showcase what the class is and what people would expect for it. Let me why don't I start talking about kind of who I am and what I've done as an artist first. So Frank did talk a little bit about what I had started with. So my first ever job in the industry was working for Infinity Ward for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. This was in a time before we even had texture artists, so I was part of the technical art team. I would go in and I would take whatever materials that they had. They had materials ranging from old Modern Warfare 2, Modern Warfare 3 textures, and then even newer ones that they've created with Infinite Warfare. And I'd bring them up to a PBR standard. For folks who don't know what PBR is, it's not Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. It's physically based rendering. It's a theory of scientific method where we're basically taking materials and we're using their physical attributes inside of a video game engine, and we're using real life measurements that we're taking. So in some of these screenshots, what I've done is I've taken various textures, or I've taken metallic values and I've brought them up to an actual physical value. This is around the time in the industry where we transitioned from what we would call like more of an ad hoc handling of textures. People would just look at a metal and say, I think this is what iron looks like, or this is what aluminum looks like. And they just kind of make it off the top of their head. And kind of the problem with that is, everyone kind of has a different eye for what people think they look good. So like I have one way of what iron looks like, Frank would have a different way, and everyone else would have a different way. So when you have a bunch of artists working on this stuff, you would have 5 different versions of iron, or even 5 different versions of like snow. And it's a little weird when you see snow not being like a proper white, maybe it looks a little yellow or a little brown. That you don't want something like that. So that's what I would do, is I would go in and I would optimize some of the textures and work on that. After that, I briefly worked with Sledgehammer Games. I didn't like how my role fit with them, so I resigned from them and started working at another company known as House. They are a marketplace for furniture. And one of the things that I worked with them was they would get these swatches from furniture companies. And essentially what I would do is I would take these swatches, I would take a bunch of color corrected images and create textures from them. So here are some examples of like certain leathers and fabrics that I've actually sampled from, and creating a full PBR texture from using Substance Designer.
And when you say sample, just so you can clarify, is this through a scanning process? Is it for something that was provided as sort of raw reference that gets processed, in some fashion? Just figured I'd ask.
So basically, essentially what it is, we would get physical fabric swatches. They're about like 10 inches by 10 inches squares. And what I'll do is I'll provide a lighted source, and I'll take a bunch of different images with the light at different angles and process them all together to create your albedo, your normal map, and then derive your other textures from those 2 maps.
Got it.
And okay. I've made sure that the textures were color corrected too. So we're getting like the proper reds or the proper greens or blues, just, making sure that we got all of them looking proper.
Thanks for explaining that. I appreciate it. Cool.
Yeah, no worries. And then after House is where I'm currently at, Sinzar Games, and they are a VR company. So the first game we had worked on was Marvel Powers United. It's a 4-player co-op game. I mostly worked in various levels, working on either prop assets or creating textures and shaders for them. So this level in particular is a subway level that we had used for our intro level, and I had worked on the water shader. I worked on a couple windows that use parallax occlusion to fake the interior of the buildings themselves. And I've worked on a bunch of other projects that I can't really talk about, but the last one we have worked on was Asgard's Wrath, which is a fantasy reality game that delves in the Norse mythology. And that's kind of where I am now.
I saw a couple of things on your portfolio that had some really, really cool procedural textures. Really, I don't know if it was part of the same project or something else, but it was some really, really beautiful stuff there.
Yeah, it was from, I believe it was from Asgard's Wrath. The game, we transitioned from many different levels, and it was crazy to jump from a level of giants where everything is supersized and you're just this really small person, to these levels that are just filled with gold and metals and all other precious things. So it was a very fun thing to work on. But now currently I'm working as a CGMA instructor, and I've just finished up my first ever course with the class, and it went very well. And I'm excited to show you guys what you guys would be briefly learning about in the course.
Terrific. Well, we'd love to see it.
So let me jump into share my screen. So here I have today, I hope everyone can see, but I have Unreal Engine 5 opened up. So if for folks who have never seen it before, this is the newest iteration of the Unreal Engine. In the class, I will teach in Unreal Engine 4. This engine still is in a beta. So it may not be good for some folks whose computers are not on the higher end. But essentially speaking, what I normally go through is I talk about the theory and application of PBR textures. So here in the level, I have some various textures that I've already brought in. The three maps that I mostly will work on in the class, besides some other ones for certain shader effects, are your albedo map, which is your color. The normal map, which uses baked in detail information with lighting, so that you can actually generate these textures on something instead of having a rock that's over 5 million polygons. And then this, it's a map that uses the red, blue, and green channels to compress grayscale maps in. And there's various ways to use this type of map. I use ORM. So the O stands for ambient occlusion, which is packed into the red channel. Mm-hmm. The roughness map, which is in the green channel, and then the metallic map, which is in the blue channel. So I have all them together so that I don't have 6 different textures. I just have 3 textures. Makes it easier. And cool. I've already created one master material that we already have to use. So essentially speaking, when we get into the class, we're going to talk about master materials and material instances. So what a master material is, it's a normal material like this, but it's usually used to create a template for different assets. So you would have one for your hero characters, for your props, for tileable world materials, and then anything else that feels like it needs a template instead of just using the same material over and over and over again, because characters are going to need a couple other extra maps versus, like, say, a wooden shield or a prop. It's going to be very, very different. So you want to create these so that you already have a template baseline, and when you have a bunch of artists, they know exactly what they need to put in. So this is what the material editor looks like, and this is what an essential master material looks like. So here we have these 3 textures that I went over, and they are turned into what we call parameters. So if you guys have ever used like Substance Designer or even like Houdini, you'll have these things known as parameters, which are they're adjustable like they're. Is this course for like real beginners, or would you recommend it for more advanced? I go over essentially everything for folks who have either never touched the material editor or folks who are advanced. So we go over various things. So our last class, we had people who have either never touched PBR textures or have never touched the material editor. So I go over everything. So it's just for folks who really want to learn more about materials and shaders. So what parameters basically are these adjustable values that you can change on the fly. So here I have the instance material. So in this one, I can go in and I can throw in any other texture I want. And if you've ever used Unreal Engine before, if you ever create a material, when you create a material and you throw textures in and you hit save, you get this thing known as like shader compiling, and it's like a loading screen basically. With this, you can change this stuff on the fly, and it will show you automatically in real time. There's no need to wait for your textures to load or anything like that. So that's one of the biggest advantages of using master materials and material instances. The other good thing is when you start applying more parameters in, you can actually go in and say, here's one rock. Maybe I want to take the same textures, but then I want to adjust it so it looks a little different. So you can add in things to adjust your albedo, so it could be a little darker or a little brighter. You can even swap out just like a single texture, so you can make it look like a completely different rock. There's a bunch of different things you can do with master materials and material instances. So that's one of the things that I go over within the first 2 weeks of the class. So the next thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and show you guys kind of a simple, no, not say simple, but a shader that is commonly used within the game industry, especially for environment prop artists. So let me throw back the textures that we already had brought in. And let me go to our materials. So I've created another master material. So we have one asset that's going to be using the normal base shader, and then we have one that's going to be using this new shader that we're going to create. So essentially what I want is I want to take this rock and I want to have it look like there's moss growing on top of it, as well as kind of add a couple other little features. Because one thing that some folks don't realize is when you're making an environment or you're making like textures and materials, you have to play it as a game. If you don't, then that's going to be a problem. So here in Unreal Engine, you have your base like third person, game template. You have to look at what you're going to be creating. So for this type of assets, it looks fine as a third person character walking around. Like say this is like Uncharted and you're Nathan Drake walking around these rocks and jumping up on top of them. It looks good. But then say if I change it so it's a first person game like Halo or Call of Duty, maybe you look up to these textures and you're like, it looks all right, but it could be better, or it could do with a little more work. So that's one thing that folks really need to understand is like when you're creating these, textures and materials and stuff, you have to understand how it's going to be shown. If it's a third person game or if it's going to be a first person game, you have to make sure you look into something like that.
Yeah, and I bet for legibility, I mean, that's all the difference in the world. And I guess if you have a game where you can switch from third to first person, I guess you probably have to be able to design for that widest range of possibilities from a gameplay standpoint.
Yeah. So like some games like Destiny, they do something like that where you can switch on the fly third person and first person. Our game Asgard's Wrath has it where it's first person VR. So you're going to be looking at these things really up close. And then there's another portion in the game where you are overtaken by a god and you have this top down view of the world. So you have to make sure that the textures also look legible and readable from something like, say, this high up or this, big. So that's one essential thing you always have to make sure of. It's very it's tough to try and make sure that you get both as a reasonable judgment call for making sure the legibility for things.
Mm-hmm.
So let's hop in here and let me go over what I've already done so far with so here inside the editor, I have these texture samples. So like when you bring in any texture, you're going to get a node that's created for that texture. So if I bring in like this granite texture, it creates a texture sample. And then you have things like your UVs where you can plug in and adjust the tiling of your UVs, or you can adjust how they're projected on a surface. You have this texture inputs where you can basically say, maybe I don't want to have a texture in here, but I want it to be sampled using something else and then have it adjusted in this node. You can do something like that as well. So this is like a proxy slot. Another thing is that you can also split your textures using the channels. So here in the ORM texture, I've already split the red channel to go into our ambient occlusion, the green into our roughness, and then the blue in our metallic. So that's another good feature that you can also go with. You can actually on the fly just say, hey, maybe I only want this channel instead of all these other ones. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is let me bring in our moss textures. Let's see that.
Just a quick question. Are your ORM files created in third-party packages outside of Unreal, like Substance, Painter, Designer, or packages like that, or where are those actually created?
So normally what they're usually created in is usually inside of Substance. So like I have a huge library of Substance materials, but just for simplicity's sake, I have them. I took them from the Megascans website. So for folks who aren't familiar, Megascans is a website that was created by Quixel, which now works with Epic Games, the guys who created the Unreal Engine. So if you have an Epic Games account, you can download these textures. And for my students, I asked them to try and use these types of textures because a lot of them are already PBR correct. They naturally work well within Unreal Engine, and they're free. So we have a creative license. If you have Unreal Engine, you have a creative license to use these in any which way you want. So it's a very great thing if you want to just, make a different material or texture on the fly and just look at a catalog of textures.
Mhm.
So here I've brought in the textures for the moss that we want. The thing that is that we need to use a node to sample where the top of this rock is versus the rest of it, so that when I rotate this rock, the top will always have moss on top, no matter where we rotate it. So one node that we use is called World Aligned Blend.
Hmm.
And what Worlds Aligned Blend is, when you're creating a texture, you're creating it in UV space. So you have your UVs, you can, look at, say, this rock. Let me go to where he is in the game. Like if I go in here and I check out his UVs, you see he has all these things that were like the UVs were cut and everything. This is what you would call UV space or object space. So this is all set to the object itself versus, say, the world itself. So when we're using something like World Align Blend, we're not going to be using the UVs itself of the object. We're going to be using the actual world coordinates of the world itself. So whenever I rotate this or wherever this goes, it will be projected along the world itself. So what we need to do now is we need to create some new parameters. So what you can do is if you hit 1 on your keyboard and you hit left click, you'll get these little nodes. These are called scalar nodes. So you can usually just get a simple value from them, like a 1, 2, or 3, any numerical value you want. And then if you want to, you can right click on them and you can convert them to a parameter, just like how these guys are parameters. So this parameter, I'm going to rename it to our blend sharpness. This is going to be our blend from the rock texture to the moss texture. So I'm going to plug this guy into the blend sharpness. And then I'm going to set like a value of, let's say like 2. You can go in and you can change any default value. What this means is when you create an instance, this is going to be the first number that pops up when you're using the parameters. So if I go and I copy it again, I'll rename this one to blend bias. So this will just how far the blend goes up and down versus how soft the transition is. So this one will just be right in here, and I'll leave him at 2 as well. So now we have this node, and we want to somehow apply these textures to these moss textures. How do we go about combining them? Well, in most cases, you can use like a multiply, add, divide nodes, mathematical nodes. Like if you've ever used Photoshop and you've done multiply, add, or divide when you're blending, these work in the same exact way. But in this case, we don't want it to be blend like right on top of each other. We want them to be separated themselves. So what we're going to use is if you hold L and you left click, you'll get this thing called a lerp. Funny name, right? What a lerp is, it's a short form for linear interpolation. And that is a transition from 0 to 1 values.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you like a kind of, from black to white gradient, because in the inside of Unreal Engine, how these numbers work is black is referenced as the number 0 and white is referenced as the number 1. So these are going to transition from whatever is going to be black or white in this alpha slot. So whatever's black is going to be using this slot, and then whatever's white is going to be using this slot. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to plug in this alpha, plug him in. And then what we're going to do next is I'm going to grab our texture for here, and he's going to be in our white spot. So if I actually want to, I can actually go and right click and use preview. And if I actually adjust these values, maybe it's not going to show up on here. Okay, so it's actually showing as dark now. Oh, Unreal Engine. It doesn't want to show the preview, but we'll get on it right now. So I'm going to plug this guy in, and I'm going to plug this guy in, and then I'm going to plug the results into our base color. So let me hit save. And let's go back here, and let me go to our materials, and let me create a new instance. So this is going to be called our advanced granite rock. And then what I'm typing in at the end is IMAT, which is short for instance material. When you're creating anything like a 3D model, a texture, or a material, you want to have something like as a suffix at the end so that you can just type those in and just search only those things. So now that I have this new instance, I'm going to drag him in. And let me hit save. And let me click on here. And let me grab our textures. So we have our granite. And then now we have these new instances where you can blend them right on top. Try and fine tune him just a little bit. So as you can see, we have our moss texture showing up. As you can see, when I'm starting to rotate, actually, let me do unlit. So you can see that he's showing up. He's showing up upside down. Why is that? There we go. So now that I've rotated, you'll see that it always remains on top versus other ways around. So let me just bring this like, say 25, and then adjust our, yeah, right there. That's perfect, actually. So now we have moss growing out on top of our texture. And if I just move him around, rotate him, he looks good.
That's a time saver to be able to do that. That's, you know, just amazing to be able to have that. Can you imagine having to do like all those different rocks custom for each rock or each area? That would just like
norm map is in the ORM slide. Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah. So
yeah, thank you for that save, Ken.
Thank you. Thank you for these smart shader attributes that really are just amazing and you know, create a lot more bang for your buck.
Yeah. So next, let me just start adding in the rest of the textures as well. One thing to note is if you're going to be using a normal map with this world align blend, you can't use the normal alpha. You have to use this explicit normal value. It's a weird thing with the world align blend node, but it's essential that you want to probably split this off because it needs to use normal information as well as alpha to blend with it. Versus like say these other textures which are more there. So when you work with a normal map, when you bring it into Unreal Engine, it actually will adjust your compressions to a different values because it knows that it's a normal map. It wants to compress it so that it handles lighting in a different way than say a normal albedo texture, because albedo and normal are handled in way different ways inside of the engine. So now let me go back and plug in that, and let's plug in our ORM. The one thing is that we're going to run into one problem, and that is that because we have our ORM texture split with RG and B, we won't be able to do that with this lerp node because it's just going to have one output. And what we could do is we can hit right click, and this brings up a very handy dandy search node. So we're going to go in here and we're going to do breakout float 3. So what it does is it takes this one value and it splits it into a R, G, and B output. So we got our ambient occlusion, our roughness, and our metallic. So now let's hit save. And then finishing up our shader compiles. Sorry, it always has to think. And then there we go. Now we have the normal map of this texture as well as its roughness and metalness also applied. Now, you can take it, further and further depending on how you want to change some things. So one cool thing you can do is for, say, this rock has two different sizes. So we have this normal size. This is what it normally is used for. And then we have this kind of larger size. We just wanted to scale it up, and maybe we want to reuse it or even throw together a couple rocks together, because in the industry, what happens is you will use rocks and boulders and stuff over and over again, but you have to try and find ways to make them look like they're a cohesive asset. So one way you can do that is, when you're dealing with this, you have your textures already set to like a certain scale. So like when you look up this close at this small of a size, this is the scale. You can supplement these details a little bit by adding in external texture maps to add detail. So we have these textures known as detail maps. So we have a albedo map and a normal map that is set for those things. So what we can do is, let's go back to our material. And then let's go into the master. And then what we will do is we're going to add a new node known as detail texturing. And what this does is it brings in our normal albedo and our normal map textures, and then it adds a additional value for a secondary map to add a little bit extra details inside the normal map and the albedo, because those are the two essential textures that show up more with shading than, say, the roughness and metalness. They're the ones that need kind of precise information. So what we'll do is we'll take this lerp that is blending the albedo, and we'll plug it into this diffuse. Diffuse is also another term for albedo. There's many different names for it. There's base color, diffuse, albedo, just general color. There's a lot of ways to describe a single map. And then we'll take our normal map and we'll plug that guy in here as well. And then let's bring in our two textures. So we have our granite and, oh, I actually did the wrong thing.
And by the way, William had a question, and it was just if you wanted the moss to always stay on one area no matter the rotation, would you just go through UVs instead of the world node that you had showed us earlier?
Yes. So normally speaking, what happens is like in whatever texturing program that you use, like Substance Painter or Quixel Mixer, you can paint your textures, the moss, wherever you want it to be. These assets, like these rocks, they don't really have a definable thing of like they have to always be on the ground. They're not like, say, a table. Tables always have to be on their legs, or same thing with like a car. A car has to be on its wheels. This guy can be used in any which way. That's why we want to use something like this moss method. But for like a car, you want the rust to always be somewhere on the top, because that's where air is going to touch the car. And you don't want a car to be flipped over unless maybe it's a damaged car or something. So yeah, that's if you want to, you can just go in and just throw it in through the UVs. But let's get back to this guy. So now we have our two textures. But if I try and plug in one of these guys, oh, not this one, actually. In this one, it says that it's not compatible. And that's because if you look at these little parentheses on here, they kind of tell you what they want. So one of which is this T2D thing, which is this is what you would call a texture sample. It needs to be turned into a texture object. And what a texture object is just a texture sample, but it cannot be modified through the node itself. It's just this is a cheaper way of handling texture samples, so that instead of having like 10 to 20 textures using these like sample nodes, you have these like cheaper ones that they're going to be used as like a small thing and not a thing that you can like throw in as a parameter to adjust. So we can go in here and we'll plug in the detail diffuse and we'll plug in our detail normal. And then we're going to do 2 more parameters. One is going to be our albedo detail. And then our normal detail. And then we'll just do like 0.5. And then after that, we just take these outputs and plug them in here and here. And let me just kind of move these guys off a little bit, because you don't want to have everything kind of all in one jumbled up space. We have a term for like these very, bless you. We have these very crazy node things known as, it's called a spaghetti mess, because of all these little wires and lines is showing up everything. You want to make sure everything's very much organized. So one thing you can also do is you can actually select these guys, and then you can hit C, and it creates like this little comment bubble around it, so that you can say like, this is our detail map, so that you can look back and see like, oh, it says detail map right here. I know where everything is in this thing. And then whatever's inside the box, you can move around. So that's one way of helping with organizing. Another way is inside of these parameters, what you can do is you can actually add groups and group them in their own individual thing to organize things. So I'm going to make one called detail texture. And then once I make it, I can go into our other parameter and then just on the drop down, just hit detail texture. And actually, let me do 0.5 as well. Hit save, and now it's going to update the instance material that we've already created. And then let's get back. And so far, it doesn't look like nothing's changed so much, but that's because we have to make our adjustments to our values now. So you can actually see something like this, where it's now adding in that added normal map detail on top. So it's actually creating a lot of detail, which maybe we don't want to have too much detail. Let's do like, say, 0.25 or something. Same thing with this guy, which you can actually also see. This is it adding the albedo texture we already applied on top, which it's sometimes it might be a hit or a miss. It just depends on the amount you just want. So let's do that. And then what we'll do is adding one more thing in, which is this scale value. And what this is doing is this is going to tile our textures so that we can adjust the scale on the fly if we want. So we'll just call this detail scale. We'll just do like 0.2. And then we'll put him down in the detail group and hit save.
You said the specs for running UE5 were a little bit more demanding. Do you remember those baseline specs offhand?
Offhand, I know one thing is it has to be an RTX enabled graphics card as one of them. But I believe it's also maybe, I think, either 16 gigabytes to 32 gigabytes on baseline. So they have, Unreal Engine has it on there, but the thing is also it's still in beta, so there's no fully defined parameter thing. What they're doing is in each iteration of the beta, they're going to add in new features. So one of the first things that they added in was 2 features known as Lumen and Nanites, which those are kind of like the big selling points for this new update. Lumen is their way of real-time global illumination without needing to bake any lighting, and Nanites is their way of handling millions and millions of polygon assets, which they're very good. But the thing is, with Nanite, you have a problem where it can only do simple textures. It can't do it won't be able to do projections onto the textures. So if you create certain details that can be moved around or adjusted, it won't work because it's just a rock in a sense. You can't adjust anything on that rock though.
So it sounds like, I mean, while it has a lot of amazing capability for processing polygons, some of the what I call the efficiencies from the older game engines are still apply. You know, in terms of working smartly.
One thing that some folks made a joke about was, do we still need normal maps now at this point? And the answer is yes, you still need normal maps because we are not defined by the engine itself. We're defined by the hardware that it's being presented on. And, you know, with the new PlayStation and Xbox, we can do a lot more than what we did with the previous generation. The thing is that we're not to the level of like a PC just yet. So what I just did was with this new update to the details, I can actually see that there's a lot more like rock like noise to this, similar to this guy. You know, you can see there's a lot of rock noise to the surface, you know, because it's a small guy. But when you scale it up, you know, when you get close, you're going to see that it's like really soft. But then now that we've had all these edges, it actually looks like this is an actual real rock instead of it just being like a scaled up version of this. And, you know, these are those things to know about when you're working in different, you know, points of view. And also, you know, these are two separate rocks, but they look like they could be one asset because of how everything's blending and working together. These are the things that you want to make sure of when you're set dressing for a level. If you set up these materials the proper way, you can get away with a lot without needing to have 10 different boulders or 10 different like pebbles or rocks and stuff to set around. Now, one last thing.
Keep going, man. I was just taking a look at the clock here, and I'm like, this is an amazing presentation. So I just wanted to make sure that you were still sort of within your, I guess, time frame.
Yeah, I don't want to set it off to be like where it's just going kind of by itself. I wanted to make sure that like everything is like, it's not, instead of it taking like 2 to 3 like hours to work on this, I'm trying to make sure that like, because when you work in the course setting, each video is, you know, 15 to 20 minutes long, 30 minutes long. So like I have to make sure that like it's digestible for students, because some folks, you know, maybe their internet is not so good. So you don't want to have an hour-long video. You definitely don't want that. So that's why I'm making sure I get this down to being like secondhand. So now the last thing I want to talk about is we're going to do, it's called triplanar projections. So what that is so I talked a little bit about like kind of what is like world space versus object space. So what triplanar projections are is when you're doing a projection, a single projection is one direction. It's either going to be up, down, or kind of left or right kind of thing. Like say this is a cube. So this is your top, this is your front, and then this is your side. Single projections will only have one side done versus say triplanar, which what that does is it projects a texture, but in all 3 of these directions. So say we have, you know, our texture, you know, this guy has all the textures already generated and it's projecting to the object spaces. Maybe we don't have that. Like we have this one texture, but maybe we don't want to have to go back in and create another one. And we already have these other textures like this granite albedo. Maybe I want to use this instead. So what we can do is, let me go in here. And let me just, sorry, let me do some organizing. Pictures. Always make sure you go in and like make sure you organize things, because you know if you're not the only artist that's going to be working on this stuff. You want to make sure that the artist that comes after you will be able to understand what you created, because that is a big given. I don't know how many times that I've like hopped into a rendering engineer's material that they've created, and I'm like, what do they do? What do they leave for me? Sometimes like they'll just leave notes for themselves, but like I don't know what the notes mean.
In other words, don't call in sick, man.
Yeah, yeah. Just don't.
You've seen.
Oh, that's all. Yeah, that's also another fun thing is like when maybe you're calling in sick and you're the only person working on this, and someone's like, hey, we need to get this done today. I'm like, sorry, I'm sick. I can't do anything right now. It's like, well, we have to. So let me do Moss World Blend. There we go. So now we have all these things organized. So now the last thing is let's do the triplanar stuff. So let's go in and let's grab our granite. And then what we need to do next is we need to take this texture sample and we need to convert it over to a object sample, kind of like what we did with the detail map stuff. Yeah. So what we're going to do next is we're going to convert this guy over to a texture object. And then what I need to do next is I need to add in world position. So normally when you're working with like UV texturing, you would use a node known as texture coordinates. And then you would adjust like these values, UV tiling or U and V tiling, so that you can adjust on the fly. Maybe you want it tiling twice or 3 times or 4 times. What this does is it just gives you the absolute world positioning in your hands. So this is just like raw world position data. We need to refine it a little bit, because when you're doing like say UV texturing, you need to just have 2 directions. So like when I mean directions, I mean X, Y, and Z. So if you guys done like coordinate graphing and stuff, you guys know what X and Y are. X is left and right, and Y is up and down. In 3D space, there's also the Z. And Z, depending on the engine, is different. In Unreal Engine, Z is up. And personally, Z is actually up. Because if you think about it in a 2D way of handling things, X and Y is going to be your, forward and back and left to right. But then you want the next value to push out. And that's why Z is considered up instead of left or right. If you work in, say, Unity, it's Y is up, and then Z is forward and backwards. So that's one thing to make sure of. So what we're going to do is we're going to mask out or separate the channels. So I'm going to add a new node called a component mask. And what this does is it will mask out certain channels on the fly. Your R and G, or your G and B, or your R and B. So let's do R and G for our X and Y. And then we're going to do G and B as our second planar projection. And then we're going to do one more for our third projection. And then it's going to be our R and B. So yeah, each one of these masks is going to be one of these, in a sense, projections of the side of each cube. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a texture sample, kind of like what I said, where let me clear it. You can use this as a proxy so that you can create a source texture and have it flow into this sample and then flow UV data through it. So I'll just grab this one, and then I'll grab this one. And each one's going to use a different UV sample. And then it's going to use the same texture sample. And then now that we have all these projections, we need to somehow combine them all together. We're going to use that same lerp node. But instead, what we need to do now is we need to mask it in a certain way. So when we're using these triplanar projections, we want it to be working with like a certain aspect of the object that we're using. In most cases, what we want is we want the normal information, because when you bring in a normal map to your like rock or your tree or something, you want it to kind of affect in a certain way, especially because, you know, certain normal maps have like cuts and grooves and stuff.
Yeah.
So what we're going to use is we're going to use this node called vertex normal world space. And what this does is it takes our normal information of the object itself, and we're going to help use it as a mask. The thing is that we now need to kind of convert this into a black or white texture. So what we'll do is I'm going to do ABS, which is, I believe it stands for absolute. So it parameterizes the value to like kind of a 0 to 1 value. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to do another node called power, which, if you guys have ever taken like trigonometry, power is kind of like adding exponent values and strength to it. So we want to make sure we have this added strength, because this is not going to give us a proper result. This kind of strengthens that result a lot better. And then now we're going to mask for both these guys separately. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do another component mask. And one is just going to be for our red channel. And then one is going to be for our green channel. Because what we're going to do is we're going to plug this guy in, and then we're going to plug him in. And then if you look at the two values, we have our R and G and our G and a B. So now we need to mask out the one value that's kind of out a little bit. So we want to make sure our red channel is going to be locked out of this guy. So it's going to mask out two sections, and then we're going to plug this version of it, and then we're going to get one last mask done with this guy. So we're going to plug him in, and boom. So what's going on is it's taking this projection and this projection, and it's going to work with them together. And then we're going to add this third projection together with this other transition. And then all I got to do is, actually, next thing I probably need to do is, let's see what's going on. Let's see how this guy looks. I might have to adjust some tiling a little bit. So let's plug him into our diffuse. Let's let it think a little bit and hit save.
It's funny how abstracted, you know, this work environment can be, but in the end, it's going to lead to a concrete effect that you're trying to achieve on the asset. So
I know,
fun to see. You know, it's a lot of setup, but you know, it always comes down to what are you trying to do with it. So it'll be interesting to see what the combined effect of everything that you had a plan for it, you know, at that level. What does it get us?
Yeah, it's well, right now it gets us this very kind of brown looking rock, and that's because the sample is still kind of small. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to add a little bit more math to this guy. So let's try and do a multiplication value for this guy and see how this is. Normally when you do like tiling, what you'll do is you'll grab your texture coordinate node and you'll multiply it with like a value, and then we can kind of see. And then let me convert this guy to tiling. Save and let him think a little bit again. Yeah, the tough part is it's a lot of it is math, and then once you get the math involved, then you can see the art result. And one of my old teachers in college had said, if you essentially think about it, art is math. Like, you know, because you have all these other things like the golden ratio and stuff, like those are actual scientific methods. So let's grab our instance material and let's throw in our tiling a little bit. Okay, I see the result. There we go. So now we're starting to get that granite texture going. So let me do one thing, because instead of doing a multiply, let's try a divide to the value. because we're going to have like this really weird exponential number, like it's like 0.0025. Maybe we don't want to have our artists use that number. So we're going to flip the divide and we're going to do like, say, 100 instead. So another quick thing you can do is if you hold control and you grab these like wires, you can actually drag them and put them in here as a quick way to like, hey, let me just do this real quickly. You can do the same thing. Math is math, Bob Parr. I think that's probably one of my favorite lines in The Incredibles 2. It's like they changed math. Math is math. So let's do 50.
I remember
So
that feeling when my kids were younger. They changed the math.
So instead of now having the weird like 0.00 whatever number, now we have like a definable number like 100. It's easier to understand, and it doesn't look so daunting to look at. And let me just throw this unlit value so we can actually see the texture itself. So this is what the projection looks like. It's projecting this granite texture on all different ways onto this one texture. And then you can just adjust the tiling a little bit more or a little less. But you essentially have a brand new albedo texture without needing to go back in and do UVs, and without needing to do going to like substance and adding in a new texture. We already have these textures inside of the engine. So this actually helps out a lot.
There are a couple of questions that came through. I don't know if you're able to kind of address them let me go ahead and publish this, both of them, and just say, Akash asks, is it better to texture moss on rocks through Substance Painter or do it through Unreal? And I think what I'm understanding the question is, maybe I'm wrong, is that you could potentially front load a lot of work in the third-party packages outside of Unreal, but it sounds like you get more variety and options within Unreal because you're stripping down these separate components of that layered texture to be able to get a little bit more editability within the engine. Is that a fair assessment in the way you work, or is that the question that it's a good question. I'm just trying to figure out what he's asking.
It has been brought up in the class previously before, and it all comes down to implementation. If this is going to be like a set dressing asset that's only used like one time, do it inside Substance Painter. If this is something that is like you have a bunch of rocks and say, they're already set to be like granite, and you want them now to all have like moss on top, like you want to be able to reuse the same asset, but then adjust the textures without needing to add in a brand new texture set. That's when you would go into the Substance or the Unreal Engine route and do the moss there.
Got it.
So it's just a matter of implementation. I believe I saw another question too.
Yeah, it was from Rose M. She said, why do you never need to mask out the blue channel?
So the reason why we have these two versus the blue channel is, so we look at these two guys. So this is going to be our X and our Y. And this is a better way to show. And then now we have our Y and our Z. And then this guy is our X and our Z. So what we're doing is we're taking these two guys and we're going to be lerping these two values together. So we have X and Y for this black value, and then we have our Y and Z. So that's one here on top, and then one here actually on this side. So we're not using the blue channel because we only need one of these values in here. And the main difference between these two guys is that I want to have one of the directions to mask out. And the main direction of this one's going to be our X and Y, which is our top value. So we already have the X value. We're just trying to mask out the kind of opposite of it. It's the same thing why we also are using the green channel. If you flip this guy and you do like your B channel. Actually, that's an error, but that's because that was 2 different slots. Let me try and compile a little bit. Yeah, that's one thing also. It's like it has to think. So what you're doing now is you're getting these weird striations, and it's because this projection is not working now because you're changing up how this secondary lerp is done. So the secondary lerp is the X and Z. So if you think about the different values, red is X, G is Y, and then B is Z. So we already kind of have our Z up value with these ones. Now we need to kind of project this like external secondary value, this X to Z values. And that's why we use this green channel, the Y channel in a sense, because that's what this one's missing is this Y. And then for this one, the R, this guy's missing that R value because we already have the R value in the black. Now we need to mask out that R value itself. So one thing you got to think about is like when you do like lerps and stuff, you have to think about it as being a black and white kind of situation. And you want to use like a certain value to mask out. And I know it's kind of tough when when you need one value and you're using 3 different values to try and like project together. It is a lot of math. And that's why like I have to like reiterate sometimes, and like I only got up to advanced algebra. I did not go into calculus, which the guys who do Houdini, I don't understand how they can do it. It is phenomenal. So in a sense, what you're using is you're using the value that you want to mask out. So we're going to mask out the X value because we already have a value that doesn't have that. And then we have a value that has a little bit of that. So it's just going to mask out like the between of these two. And then the same thing goes with the Y value because this guy's missing that Y value. And then this guy's missing that X value.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, glad we're getting the questions that we did. I actually, I just noticed the clock. It's definitely well over an hour. I didn't know if there was time for at least about maybe 10 minutes of just general Q&A from our attendees or even, from our list. And, this is a very in-depth kind of view to your class and what students can look forward to. But, I also wanted to open up, the Q&A to maybe some other things related to shading and lighting, as well as a little bit about, maybe your background, how did you discover your love for game art? I know it's kind of an assumption that you got to love games, but for a lot of people who are in the business, but I mean, were you always a gamer? Did you do stuff before that was like a career primer for game art, or, tell us like kind of, because you're in the sliding scale of instructors that we have, you're I would say on the younger side when it comes to just the experience set. So I wanted to find out, like, I guess, from your perspective, what was that like, that transition? It's like, yes, game art. Like, was that a very young decision, or when did you make that decision?
So, well, I mean, I have been a gamer since I was a kid. Like, the first game console I ever remember playing was the Super Nintendo, which even that thing predates me. I'm born in 1994, and the Super Nintendo came out in like 1992 or something. Yeah. And so, like, that was like the first thing I remember playing, and like that was like very early memories of it. But like, even growing up, I was this kid who I could draw a little bit, but I wasn't good at drawing. And then I was good at building things like Legos and stuff. So I thought, like, what could I do to kind of combine these two things that I like the most? And funny enough, I saw 2 things. I saw how it's made, like, Discovery Channel thing about like how do they make video games, and they showed off like the creation of Prince of Persia. And I was like, this seems like something like I was good at computers, and it was like, as well, trying to see if I can combine the 2 things. But then also, like, I like animation, I like, film, I like all these other things. So like, what really sets it apart? And then I saw the movie Grandma's Boy, which is like Adam Sandler's take on the video game industry. And I'm like, this seems like it's a funny movie, but I'm like the culture like of these like nerdy guys, but like they're going together on this one project. It's like a creative thing. I was like, this seems like something I might be more interested in. So when I was in high school, I took animation and modeling classes, and we had someone from the Art Institute come by and say, you know, hey, this is what our students in the game art and design class are doing. You know, this might be something really fun for you guys to try out. And I'm like, you know, I might be interested in that because one thing I don't like is I don't like render times. And, you know, your background working with like animation and stuff, like render times, especially like in film, like animation films, it's killer. It takes days, if not months, to render out the final product. I'm like, I can't do that.
Well, there's a reason why people are starting to be incredibly inspired by the possibilities with real-time rendering, especially in UE5. I see, you know, the promise of what I was working on back when I was literally kind of designing a commercial from, you know, video game assets just by literally filming within the game engine back on when I was working Madden 2006. I'm dating myself. But, you know, I mean, back then, even the promise of making storytelling with these tools, you know, we're here, you know, we're literally are arriving at that possibility. So not having to wait for render frames is, in my mind, miraculous, you know? So, but anyway, I get what you're talking about. Yeah, and by the way, guys, in the crowd here, if you got any questions for him, we have them here. So definitely get your questions out if you have them. So, I mean, what was it like? I mean, did you have any clear support from your family? Were they concerned about you being, you know, involved with games? You know, were there artists in your family, or are you kind of like solo, you know, in terms of your interests that way?
I was definitely, well, I was very much solo as an artist. Like my dad is a maintenance guy. So like, you know, he focused more on like plumbing and stuff, but he did have a background in architecture. So I'm like maybe genetically, like that's where my art comes from. And then my mom, she's a bartender. So her art for mixing, maybe that's something I don't know. But the funny thing was when I took open house for the Art Institute, I remember my dad actually asking the teacher, can he make money off this job? Like, is this like a good industry? And my teacher is like, his name is Nick Marks. He was like, yes, this industry makes more money than the film and animation and television industries combined. Like you can make money off it. You know, you just have to work hard. And my dad's like, okay. So after that, my parents were essentially sold. They're like, it's not like I went through the parents disapprove of the struggling artist thing. It was get some sunlight and go outside every once in a while because you're cramped up in this dark room kind of thing.
And that makes total sense, having lived in it and been in the dark cave development rooms that can happen from you know, time to time, depending on what part of your milestones you're in.
Yeah,
you know, or what time of day or night it is. So
I know. Like, see this, I always try and keep the curtains as like closed as possible because I'm a gremlin with this.
oh man,
Like this light right here is like the artificial sunlight I get. It's
you know, so it sounds like Unreal has been sort of your main engine that you worked out of. Have you had any other frame of reference in working other game engines as well? I think you mentioned obviously you were doing AR or VR related work. So imagine it's a slightly different dynamic.
yeah. So I've worked in proprietary engines with like an Infinity Ward. You know, their engines based off of the old Quake engine, you know, from days and days and days, you know, years ago.
Yeah.
But I have worked in Unity and also in CryEngine for brief like freelance stuff. And like CryEngine to me still has one of the best lighting engines. The problem was that CryEngine was such a tough curve to get assets even in because you had to like use their import settings that were, you know, you have to like set up a plugin inside of whatever 3D modeling program you're using, and then have it import in, which that gives you training for when you're working in a proprietary engine, but it's not good for the general consumer artist. Yeah. Like me, I did not know I can go onto YouTube now and just look at how many thousand guys are doing tutorials and like, you know, hey, import this, import that, easy to do. CryEngine was like, there was nothing on it. It was something that only the folks that worked at those studios could do.
Mm-hmm.
And then Unity was good, but the thing was that Unity's their backend was very hard on handling performance for a lot of things. Like, there are great games that come out of Unity, but the thing is that it takes a lot for them to get the fidelity that comes with Unreal Engine, especially with Unreal Engine's new tools like with Nanite and stuff, and how they're going to be able to handle like more processing stuff in the end. That's going to be a big game changer. Unity, their systems, especially because they're more geared towards like software and not art. Like, they do have an art pipeline, but it's still, it's software centric.
Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, mentioned something about learning on YouTube and a variety of other sources, depending on your level of interest and what kind of game engine. I guess if you had to describe to potential students in your class, what do you think they're going to get out of your class that's different than maybe just kind of getting videos online?
Well, the thing that comes with getting videos online is you're only getting a one-sided conversation from it. So the thing is that, like, you'll find some guy who has like the worst microphone ever trying to tell you how to do like vertex painting or how to set up like a certain shader or something. But the thing is that, you're just going to be copying along on what they're doing. And in some cases, they don't describe it, or they're not describing it properly because they probably have their own rudimentary way of doing it. What I've done is I've gone through, and I'll show you guys the examples of what they show inside of Unreal Engine's, like, in a sense, their wiki of what the features are, like vertex coloring or vertex painting. And I'll like go through frame by frame of it. And the thing is that it's not just like a one-sided conversation on there. I'm, also here when you do the Q&As, or we have like a built-in Discord for the classes as well. And if students ever have an issue or a problem, they can always reach out to me, which, if you've ever gone on YouTube and you found like an old Unreal Engine video from like 2012, try messaging that guy again now to see like, hey, how did you do this? And he's never going to reply back.
I know when I was doing computer graphics years ago, and I still do stuff now, we know that UVs are still a big part of the reality of managing materials and shaders. There's always been this sort of promise of, whether or not we're going to get rid of UVs for creating assets. I've never seen it, at least yet, but there was a question from Donald A. He says, he was asking, have you seen Nanite in UI5, the end of poly counts? And I don't know if there's a possibility, maybe we don't have time for that, but either here or maybe doing in your class. I don't know if you talk anything about UE5, getting into setting up vertex colors and a no UVs workflow. I mean, is that like, a crazy dream to even think about down the road? Or
I mean, it's not impossible. The thing is that it takes a lot mathematically to do something like that, because you're basically, the reason why we can get away with doing like these effects now is because we already have stuff done on the back end with like an asset that's already UV'd, or an asset that already has textures baked out. That is, one draw call out of the performance. The thing is that with doing these procedural things like on the fly inside of Unreal Engine, is you're basically having to rebuild the stuff that's already been pre-made inside of something else.
Got it.
So that comes with a problem. Like, that's where the problem kind of comes in, where it's like, can Unreal Engine handle the backload of all that mathematical information first and then handle it? Like, say with like Nanite, what Nanite does is it's kind of like how the Unreal Engine imposter syndrome works, where it kind of caches the information and then kind of leaves you with a proxy that it will render the model, but then it caches out all that polygonal information into other things. Again, the problem with that is it's great for like vistas, like assets that you don't really interact with, or they're more like architecture. But the thing is, when you want to do stuff like, maybe you want to be able to shoot that rock, and then depending on how your system works, if you're using like decals or anything that uses a projection like blood or something, that's not going to show up on those assets because Nanite cannot handle at this point projections. So that's like one issue that comes with Nanite. But again, this is 5.0 Unreal Engine. We're not even getting the full 5.0 release yet. So down the line, that might be not the case anymore, and we might be able to do that, and that is a huge advantage once we get to that. So as of right now, especially with how big games are going to become and how the software is going to be handled, no UV workflows are still not all the way there for every asset. You could do it for some things. Like I've seen people handle in Houdini certain smaller set dressing assets or some simple assets that like maybe you just need a box and the box has like a simple texture or something, or even in say certain rocks, you could do that. But we're still not at the way of no UVs yet.
Well, thanks for clarifying. Ken L has got a question. He said, what are your thoughts on Unreal's layered material system? Do you see adopting this technique for future game projects?
I did see the new update for it, and I do think it's a very great asset for because right now how we handle layered materials right now is within just one giant like master material. And the thing is that like if you bring in any other artist, like as a simple way, bring in any other artist or technical artist into one of these things, and you'll see like thousands of nodes, and you're like, okay, how do I even read this? How do I understand this? It's daunting to try and figure out where the start and the end is. With the new layered system, that's going to help out a lot when it comes to if it kind of like what we talked about before was like how you handle like moss, if you want to handle it within a texture or if you want to handle it within the engine, that's going to help out a lot with implementation on that. I mean, Unreal Engine worked on some like a version of that with their Paragon assets, and it was an amazing thing because you already have all this like in a sense more raw uncompressed data inside of the engine, and then they can just layer it out and it looks great like up close. And I think that's one of the other good things about with layered assets is you can actually have like up close assets, and then like when you get to a certain distance per se, it can layer out to a different lower res texture. So there's a lot of great advances that can come with the new layered system.
I got a question just to kind of give it a little context, because we get pretty technical in this particular class. If I was a potential student in your class, what skill set should I have in order to be able to participate in your course?
Well, I would say skill set wise is the at least the essential understanding of what a node based system is, like these inputs and outputs and stuff. That's the most feasible thing I could think of. So if you have never touched the Unreal Engine material editor, or say you've like maybe you've used Substance briefly before, like Substance Designer, that would be a great thing to kind of get the feeling of the understanding of inputs and outputs. That's like an essential thing I would say for this class, because once we start going from the base master materials and instances, we're going to go further into things like creating material functions, which are in their own way a node that is filled with a bunch of other nodes. And we use that for like organization's sake, as well as being able to adjust things more on the fly, like a bunch of other nodes on the fly. And with that, you have to understand kind of what an input is and an output is. And then the other thing is the understanding of certain input slots and output slots aren't just going to be a color or like a texture. There's going to be things like when we start creating like a material, we have in one of the classes, we go over material layers, or in a sense, a layered material. And that I do go over material input slots. So it's like this input and output is not just like one texture, it's all the textures plugged in, and it outputs to all those textures instead of it just being like one single thing. So definitely understanding of what inputs and outputs are and how node systems kind of should work generally, that will help.
Okay, that's great. I wanted to ask a couple of questions related to like when you first got your job, because I mean, you're still kind of relatively young, but so you probably remember what it was like to go from student to first job. And I wanted to ask about like what kinds of things, if I was a junior modeling texture artist, what should I have on my reel, and how many pieces are enough? Does it matter if the pieces are complex? Should I do, simpler pieces done well? What are the kinds of things that junior artists are going to be expected to do in a typical production environment for games?
Well, I think one thing that some folks like you'll never ever not hear when it comes to like portfolio reviews is there's always the less is more approach, quality over quantity. One thing that some folks don't really talk too much about is what is your end goal of a studio? So, like, say, like my personal portfolio is on the more realistic side of things. So, I would not see myself applying to a job like at Blizzard or like another like stylized studio. My portfolio is realistic. It will not fit or work.
Mhm.
But the other thing is also you have to show marketable marketable skills. So at least having one good environment, one very great environment that like it showcases everything. One because one thing is like if you're showing in an environment, you're not just showing like say, here's one portfolio piece. It's showing that generally speaking, a well-rounded portfolio of stuff. It's in say for like a character artist, it's like having a character rendered, rigged, and animated. Like having all of those things kind of wound in together into one portfolio piece really shows. And if it's executed very well, and it's not like say I have a bunch of 4K textures, or I have like all of these like assets that I decimated from ZBrush. You have to make sure you're also showing that optimization. So if you can show a great scene that is optimized using just in generally great game texture techniques, that goes a long way. If you have like me, I also do material stuff, and I have gotten job offers for material jobs. I have a full list of different types of materials I've done, either photo scan materials, substance materials, or just in general materials that I've used like ZBrush with. So having something like that, if you are doing materials or you want to do materials, something like that, if you props, have at least 1 to 2 or even 3 good props. But the thing is, don't have 5 environments, 5 materials, and then like 10 props or something, or like taking 1 prop out of your environment and using it as a separate piece. Don't do something like that. It really dilutes what you can do. So if you want 1 environment, 1 prop, and 1 like material that look amazing, that's all you need.
Cool. Thank you very much for kind of walking us through that. It's exciting to see how far we've come with asset creation. So good to see this generation of artists really taking hold of these awesome tool sets. There's never been a better time to be an artist than it is now. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean the big thing is that like so long as students can, because the big thing is the advancements of automated textures and materials and all the other pipeline stuff. The good thing is that if you still have students that are willing to know what the things are, like when I first started learning texturing is like when Dedo first came around, and then Substance came around after. People forgot how and what textures were. Like I had, out of my graduating class, I was the only one that actually knew what a normal map was, what PPR texturing was, like all those little things. And like when I took my first texturing class inside of the college, my teacher, because at that point Art Institute kind of would allow anyone to teach as long as they had some kind of basic background. He didn't teach us PBR. He didn't teach us like what every texture did. He just said, here's UVing, here's a little bit of UDK, and that's it. And that was 11 weeks. And I was like, I wish they would have taught what PBR texturing was and how the implementation was, because the thing with some folks is they think PBR is just albedo, roughness, metalness, when there's other textures to use. And then the other problem that comes with that is folks get really confused by that. They're like, oh, I have these 3 textures, like I'm PBR. I'm like, no, that's you're just scratching the surface off that.
I'm thrilled, with the new tools, and it's good to see them evolving so beautifully. Well, hey, look, I just realized that We are definitely hitting almost the 90-minute mark. Can you believe time has flied so much within our presentation here? And I'm glad you were able to take the time out of your busy day to be a part of this webinar. So on behalf of CGMA, we just want to thank you for sharing your background, workflow, and insights on all things related to shading and material creation in UE4. On behalf of CGMA, my name is Frank Cordero, and it is a pleasure to host this webinar with all of you guys. Thank you again for making the time to show up, and we'll see you next time.